Now let's look at minimizing detraining during the competitive phase, and I'm going to show you some research here that's applicable. I already talked about the role of the weight room on the endocrine system. And the endocrine system, if you're unfamiliar, is what we're basically talking about is all of your hormonal systems. And as Justin Gatlin and Ben Johnson and many others can tell you, the hormonal system has profound effect on performance. You know, what we're trying to do as coaches is produce similar effects on performance levels legally, and there are some ways we can do that. Here's a quote from a study by Escudero. DTR stands for detraining, complete cessation of training here. And I'll let you read it and then we'll go over it. TAP stands for taper. Now the important part here is this last line here. These data indicated that detraining may induce larger declines in muscle power output than in maximal strength. Detraining may induce larger declines in power output than maximal strength, whereas a taper may result in further strength enhancement. So if we taper off our training, you can actually get an increase in strength development. Now, one thing that you can probably take home from this is that we're actually seeing some variability in the decrement drop-offs depending on how we regulate the stimulus. And we'll get into this in later slides here. When we talk about the varying residual effects of training, what I want you to see here is that these various biomotor abilities, they detrain and train at different rates. They detrain and train at different rates. And we're going to look at a couple studies here that will support this point. Another quote from a research study. Despite the strength losses, significant levels of strength are retrained even after 20 weeks of detraining. That might be to be expected given our first slide, which showed that we can reach high levels of, or we can get a very steep inclination of our training adaptation progress just by regular training. But the results have important implications for resistance-trained older adults who could undergo planned or underplanned training interruptions of up to 5 months. So that means, if we look at this one here, strength values, what we see here is that strength values can be retained for quite a long period of time. Strength values can be retained for quite a long period of time. Now we have another one on the other end of the spectrum, or maybe kind of slightly linking in. A long interruption in training has negligible effect on short sprintability and muscle anaerobic potential. But on the other hand, a persistent training stimulus is required to maintain high aerobic capacity and muscle oxidative potential. And what we're seeing is that, and this kind of supports what I found with, say, intensive tempo work, is that we need to return to that level of activity on a fairly regular basis, because it seems like the enzymatic processes tend to drop off a little bit quicker than, say, the biomotor abilities that are strictly a function of our physical capabilities, or basically our muscle architecture. One more study for you here. These results suggest that shot put performance remains unaltered after 4 weeks of complete detraining in moderate resistance trained subjects. This might be linked to the concomitant reduction of muscle fiber CSA, cross-sectional area, and increase in the percentage of type 2X muscle fibers. Now, if you were in here for Dr. Judge's presentation and he gave the example of one of his throwers who went to world championships and she had just returned from the Caribbean and had not trained for 6 weeks and then went to world champs and threw at a very high level, this sounds strikingly familiar. Now a lot of us in here are not just dealing with the weight throws. Perhaps we're dealing with sprinters. And then we have to factor in other issues, or the issues of enzymatic processes, or more applicably speed endurance qualities need to be trained on a fairly regular basis. But what I want you to see here is that these rates of decline of one biomotor ability to the next vary. Anaerobic capacities tend to drop off very quickly. On the other hand, aerobic and maximal strength qualities are relatively long-lasting. Aerobic and maximal strength qualities are relatively long-lasting. Now, what effect would this have on our training plan? Well, that means that we probably need to be addressing anaerobic capacities fairly regularly if we want to keep the level of adaptation that we have already developed. On the other end of the spectrum, we can probably say, I'm going to let aerobic and maximal strength development perhaps be kept at a fairly low volume and only touch base on it when I need to, because I can maintain those qualities with very low dosage. Now let's apply these concepts to some real-world examples. First, a summary of what we've already gone over. If we want to extend or create a plateau of high performance level preparedness, we need to extend our physical preparation period. Now this doesn't necessarily mean do general physical prep for 6 months of the year, but the training plan as a whole, or the macrocycle as a whole, should be longer. Remember, or keep in mind, the soon ripe, soon rotten concept. We want to minimize training interruptions, because as we've already seen, that any time there's a training interruption, you're going to get, basically, you're going to get this detraining effect. And then we get back into that retraining phenomenon. We have to retrain them to get them back to their previous levels. And one thing you want to note here is that we often think of training plan interruptions as being perhaps just when the kids go on spring break or when they go home for Christmas break. Training plan interruptions could be something that we impose ourselves. If we do acceleration in the fall and then we don't touch base on acceleration again